Hello, everybody. Come in round by the fire. It's, time once again for some, bedtime stories with Kaybe. Alrighty. Now, my, camera seems to be a little off-center. There we go. Alright. I guess that'll do. That'll do alright. Can I tilt my head down a little bit more? Oh. Alright. So, we're going to get started in just a moment. Today, we are continuing to work our way through my book of Grimm's fairy tales. Today, we will be reading The Water of Life first, and afterwards, we shall read The Goose Girl. I see we have one viewer in chat. Hello. Good to see you. Going to go ahead and get started. The Water of Life. A king was very ill, and no one believed that he would come out of it with his life. He had 3 sons, who were much distressed about it, and went down into the palace garden and wept. There they met an old man who inquired as to the cause of their grief. They told him that their father was so ill that he would most certainly die, for nothing seemed to cure him. Then the old man said, "I know of one more remedy, and that is the water of life. If he drinks it, he will become well again. But it is hard to find." The eldest said, "I will manage to find it," and went to the sick king and begged to be allowed to go forth in search of the water of life, for that alone could save him. "No," said the king, "the danger of it is too great. I would rather die." But he begged so long that the king consented. The prince thought in his heart, "If I bring the water, then I shall be best beloved of my father, and I shall inherit the kingdom." So he set out, and when he had ridden forth a little distance, a dwarf stood there in the road, who called to him and said, "Whither away so fast?" "Silly shrimp," said the prince, very haughtily. "It is nothing to you," and rode on. But the little dwarf had grown angry, and had wished an evil wish. Soon after this, the prince entered a ravine, and the farther he rode, the closer the mountains drew together, and at last the road became so narrow that he could not advance a step further. It was impossible either to turn his horse or dismount from the saddle, and he was shut in there as if in a prison. The sick king waited long for him, but he came not. Then the second son said, "Father, let me go forth and seek the water." And he thought to himself, "If my brother is dead, then the kingdom will fall to me." At first, the king would not allow him to go either, but at last he yielded. So the prince set out on the same road that his brother had taken. And he too met the dwarf, who stopped him to ask whither he was going in such haste. "Little shrimp," said the prince, "that is nothing to you," and rode on without giving him another look. But the dwarf bewitched him, and he, like the other, got into a ravine, and could neither go forwards nor backwards. So fare the haughty people. As the second son also remained away, the youngest begged to be allowed to go forth and fetch the water, and at last the king was obliged to let him go. When he met the dwarf, and later asked him whither he was going in such haste, he stopped, gave him an explanation, and said, I am seeking water of life for my father who is sick unto death. Dost thou know, then, where that is to be found? No, said the prince. Then, said the dwarf, as thou hast borne thyself politely, and not haughtily like thy false brothers, I will give thee the information, and tell thee how thou mayest obtain the water of life. It springs from a fountain in the courtyard of an enchanted castle, but thou wilt not be able to make thy way to it, if I do not give thee an iron wand and 2 small loaves of bread. Strike thrice with the wand on the iron door of the castle, and it will spring open. Inside lie 2 lions with gaping jaws. But if thou throwest a loaf to each of them, they will be quieted. Then hasten to fetch some of the water of life before the clock strikes 12. Else the door will shut again, and thou wilt be imprisoned. The prince thanked him, took the wand and the bread, and set out on his way. When he arrived, everything was as the dwarf had said. The door sprang open at the 3rd stroke of the wand, and when he had appeased the lions with the bread, he entered into the castle, and came in a large and splendid hall, wherein sat some enchanted princes, whose rings he drew off their fingers. A sword and a loaf of bread were lying there, which he carried away. After this, he entered a chamber, in which was a beautiful maiden, who rejoiced when she saw him, kissed him, and told him that he had delivered... kissed him, and told him that he had delivered her, and should have the whole of her kingdom, and that if he would return in a year, their wedding would be celebrated. Likewise she told him where the spring of the water of life was, and that he was to hasten and draw some of it before the clock struck 12. Then he went onwards, and at last entered a room where there was a beautifully newly made bed, and he was very weary and felt inclined to rest a little. So he lay down and fell asleep. When he awoke, it was striking 11:45. He sprang up in a fright, ran to the spring, and drew some water in a cup which stood near, and hastened away. But just as he was passing through the iron door, the clock struck 12, and the door fell with such violence that it carried away a piece of his heel. He, however, rejoicing at having obtained the water of life, went homewards, and again passed the dwarf. When the latter saw the sword and the loaf, he said, "With these thou hast won great wealth. With the sword thou canst slay whole armies, and the bread will never come to an end." But the prince would not go home to his father without his brothers, and said, "Dear dwarf, canst thou not tell me where my 2 brothers are? They went out before I did in search of the water of life, and have not returned." "They are imprisoned between 2 mountains," said the dwarf. "I have condemned them to stay there, because they were so haughty." Then the prince begged until the dwarf released them. He warned him, however, and said, "Beware of them, for they have bad hearts." When his brothers came, he rejoiced, and told them how things had gone with them, that he had found the water of life, and that he had brought a cupful away with them, and had delivered a beautiful princess, who was willing to wait a year for him, and then their wedding was to be celebrated, and he would obtain a great kingdom. After that, they rode on together, and chanced upon a land where war and famine reigned. And the king already thought he must perish, for the scarcity was so great. Then the prince went to him, and gave him the loaf, wherewith he fed and satisfied the whole of his kingdom. And then the prince gave him the sword also, wherewith he slew the host of his enemies, and could now live in rest and peace. The prince then took back his loaf and his sword, and the three brothers rode on. After this, they entered 2 more countries, where war and famine reigned. And each time the prince gave his loaf and his sword to the kings, and had now delivered 3 kingdoms. And after that, they went on board a ship, and sailed overseas. During the passage, the 2 eldest conversed apart and said, "The youngest has found the water of life, and not we. For that our father will give him the kingdom which belongs to us, and he will rob us all of our fortune." They began to seek revenge, and plotted with each other to destroy him. They waited until when they found him fast asleep. Then they poured the water of life out of the cup, and took it for themselves. But into the cup they poured salty seawater. Now, therefore, when they arrived at home, the youngest took his cup to the sick king, in order that he might drink of it, and be cured. But scarcely had he drunk a very little of the salty seawater, than he became still worse than before. And as he was lamenting over this, the 2 eldest brothers came, and accused the youngest of having intended to poison him, and said that they had brought with him the true water of life, and handed it to him. He had scarcely tasted it, when he felt his sickness departing, and became strong and healthy as in the days of his youth. After that they both went to the youngest, mocked him, and said, "You certainly found the water of life, but you have had the pain and we the gain. You should have been sharper, and should have kept your eyes open. We took it from you while you were asleep at sea, and when a year is over, one of us will go and fetch the beautiful princess. But beware that you do not disclose aught of this to our father. Indeed, he does not trust you, and if you say a single word, you shall lose your life in the bargain. But if you keep silent, you shall have it as a gift." And the old king was angry with his youngest son, and thought he had plotted against his life. So he summoned the court together, and had a sentence pronounced upon his son, that he should be secretly shot. And once the prince was riding forth to the chase, suspecting no evil, the king's huntsman had to go with him. And when they were quite alone in the forest, the huntsman looked so sorrowful that the prince said to him, "Dear huntsman, what ails you?" The huntsman said, "I cannot tell you, and yet I ought." Then the prince said, "Say openly what it is. I will pardon you." "Alas," said the huntsman, "I am to shoot you dead. The king has ordered me to do it." Then the prince was shocked, and said, "Dear huntsman, let me live. There, I give you my royal garments. Give me your common ones in their stead." The huntsman said, "I will willingly do that. Indeed, I should not have been able to shoot you." Then they exchanged clothes, and the huntsman returned home. The prince, however, went further into the forest. After a time, 3 wagons of gold and precious stones came to the king for his youngest son, which were sent by the 3 kings who had slain their enemies with the prince's sword, and maintained their people with his bread, and who wished to show their gratitude for it. The old king then thought, "Can my son have been innocent?" and said to his people, "Would that he were still alive! How it grieves me that I have suffered him to be killed." "He still lives," said the huntsman. "I could not find it in my heart to carry out your command," and he told the king how it had happened. Then a great weight fell from the king's heart, and he had it proclaimed in every county, every country, that his son might return and be taken into favor again. The princess, however, had a road made up to her palace, which was quite bright and golden. and told her people that whosoever came riding straight along it to her would be the right wooer and was to be admitted, and whoever rode by the side of it was not the right one, and was not to be admitted. As the time was now close at hand, and the eldest son thought that he would hasten to go to the king's daughter, and give himself out as her deliverer, and thus win her for his bride, and the kingdom to boot. Therefore he rode forth, and when he arrived in front of the palace, and saw that splendid golden road, he thought it would be a sin and a shame if he were to ride over that, and turned aside and rode on the right side of it. When he came to the door, and the servants told him that he was not the right man, and was to go away again. Soon after this, the second prince set out. And when he came to the golden road, and his horse had put 1 foot on it, he thought that it would be a sin and a shame to tread a piece of it off, and he turned aside and rode on the left side of it. And when he reached the door, the attendants told him that he was not the right one, and he was to go away again. When at last the year had entirely expired, the third son likewise wished to ride out of the forest to his beloved, with her to forget his sorrows. So he set out, and thought of her so incessantly, and wished to be with her so much, that he never noticed the golden road at all. So his horse rode onwards up the middle of it, and when he came through the door it was opened, and the princess received him with joy, and said he was her deliverer, and the lord of the kingdom, and their wedding was celebrated with great rejoicing. When it was over, she told him that his father invited him to come to him, and had forgiven him. So he rode thither, and told him everything, how his brothers had betrayed him, and how he had nevertheless kept silence. The old king wished to punish them, but they had put to sea, and never came back as long as they lived. And that is the story of the water of life. Alright. So we will read one more story today. We will be reading The Goose Girl. Alright. There was, once upon a time, an old queen, whose husband had been dead for many years, and she had a beautiful daughter. When the princess grew up, she was betrothed to a prince who lived at a great distance. When the time came for her to be married, and she had to journey forth into the distant kingdom, the aged queen packed up for her many costly vessels of silver and gold, and trinkets also of gold and silver, and cups and jewels, in short, everything which appertained to a royal dowry. For she loved her child with all her heart. She likewise sent her maid-in-waiting, who was to ride with her, and hand her over to the bridegroom. And each had a horse for the journey. But the horse of the king's daughter was called Falada, and could speak. So, when the hour of parting had come, the aged mother went into her bedroom, took a small knife, and cut her finger with it until it bled. Then she held a white handkerchief to it, into which she let 3 drops of blood fall, and gave it to her daughter and said, "Dear child, preserve this carefully. It will be of service to you on your way." So they took a sorrowful leave of each other. The princess put the piece of cloth in her bosom, mounted her horse, and then went away to her bridegroom. After she had ridden for a while, she felt a burning thirst, and said to her waiting maid, Dismount, and take my cup which you have brought for me, and get me some water from the stream, so I should like a drink." "If you are thirsty," said the waiting-maid, "get off your horse yourself, and lie down and drink out of the water. I don't choose to be your servant." So in her great thirst, the princess alighted, bent down over the water in the stream, and drank, and was not allowed to drink out of the golden cup. Then she said, "Ah, heaven!" And the 3 drops of blood answered, "If your mother knew this, her heart would break." But the king's daughter was humble, said nothing, and mounted her horse again. She rode some miles further, but as the day was warm, the sun scorched her, and she was thirsty once more. And when they came to a stream of water, she again cried to her waiting-maid, "Dismount and give me some water in my golden cup," for she had long ago forgotten the girl's ill words. But the waiting-maid said still more haughtily, "If you wish to drink, drink as you can. I don't choose to be your maid." Then in her great thirst the king's daughter alighted, bent over the flowing stream, and wept, and said, "Ah, heaven!" But the drops of blood replied again, "If your mother knew this, her heart would break." And as she was thus drinking, and leaning right over the stream, the handkerchief with 3 drops of blood fell out of her bosom, and floated away with the water without her observing it, so great was her trouble. The waiting-maid, however, had seen it, and she rejoiced to think that she now had power over the bride, for since the princess had lost the drops of blood, she had become weak and powerless. So now, when she wanted to mount her horse again, the one that was called Falada, the waiting-maid said, "Falada is more suitable for me, and my nag will do for you." And the princess had to be content with that. Then the waiting-maid, with many hard words, bade the princess exchange her royal apparel for her own shabby clothes. And at length she was compelled to swear by the clear sky above her that she would not say one word of this to anyone at the royal court. And if she had not taken this oath, she would have been killed on the spot, but Falada saw all this, and observed it well. The waiting-maid now mounted the talking horse, and the true bride had the bad horse, and thus they travelled onward, until at length they entered the royal palace. There was great rejoicing over her arrival, and the prince sprang forward to meet her, lifted the waiting-maid from her horse, and thought that she was his consort. She was conducted upstairs, but the real princess was left standing below. Then the old king looked out of the window, and saw her standing in the courtyard, and how dainty and delicate and beautiful she was, and he instantly went to the royal apartment, and asked the bride about the girl she had with her, who was standing down below in the courtyard, and who she was. "I picked her up on the way for a companion. Give the girl something to work at, that she might not stand idle." But the old king had no work for her, and knew of none, so he said, "I have a little boy who tends the geese. She may help him." The boy was called Conrad, and the true bride had to help him tend the geese. Soon afterwards, the false bride said to the young king, "Dearest husband, I beg you to do me a favor." He answered, "I will do it so most willingly." "Then send for a knacker, and have the head of that horse on which I rode here cut off, for it vexed me on my way." In reality, she was afraid that the horse might tell how she had behaved to the king's daughter, and that she had succeeded in making the king promise that it should be done. Then she succeeded in making the king promise that it should be done, and the faithful Falada was to die. This came to the ears of the real princess, and she secretly promised to pay the knacker a piece of gold if he would perform a small service for her. There was a great dark-looking gateway in the town, through which morning and evening she had to pass with the geese. Would he be so good as to nail up Falada's head on it, so that she might see him again, and more than once? The knacker's man promised to do that, and cut off the head, and nailed it fast beneath the dark gateway. Early in the morning, when she and Conrad drove out the flock beneath this gateway, she said in passing, "Alas, Falada, hanging here." Then the head answered, "Alas, young queen, how ill you fare. If this your tender mother knew, her heart would surely break in two." Then they went still further out of the town and drove the geese into the country. And when they had come to the meadow, she sat down and unbound her hair, which was like pure gold. And Conrad saw it and delighted in its brightness, and wanted to pluck out a few hairs. Then she said, "Blow, blow, thou gentle wind, I say. Blow Conrad's little hat away, and make him chase it here and there, until I have braided all my hair and bound it up again." And then there came such a violent wind that it blew Conrad's hat far away across the country, and he was forced to run after it. When he came back, she had finished combing her hair and putting it up again, and he could not get any of it. Then Conrad was angry, and would not speak to her, and thus they watched the geese until the evening, and then they went home. The next day, they were driving the geese out through the dark gateway. The maiden said, "Alas, Falada, hanging there." Falada answered, "Alas, young queen, how ill you fare. If this your tender mother knew, her heart would surely break in two." And she sat down again in the field, and began to comb out her hair, and Conrad ran and tried to clutch it. So she said in haste, "Blow, blow, thou gentle wind, I say, blow Conrad's little hat away, and make him chase it here and there, until I have braided all my hair, and bound it up again." Then the wind blew, and blew his little hat off his head and far away, and Conrad was forced to run after it. And when he came back, her hair had been put up a long time, and he could get at none of it. And so they looked after the geese till evening came. But in the evening, after they had gotten home, Conrad went to the old king and said, "I won't tend the geese with that girl any longer." "Why not?" inquired the aged king. "Oh, because she vexes me the whole day long." Then the king commanded him to relate what it was that she did to him. Conrad said, "In the morning, when we passed beneath the dark gateway with the flock, there's a sorry horse's head on the wall, and it says, and she says to it, 'Alas, Falada, hanging there.' And the head replies, 'Alas, young queen, how ill you fare. If this your tender mother knew, her heart would surely break in two.'" And Conrad went on to relate what happened on the goose pasture, and how when there he had to chase his hat. The aged king commanded him to drive his flock out again the next day. And as soon as morning came, he placed himself behind the dark gateway, and heard how the maiden spoke to the head of Falada. And then he too went into the country, and hid himself in the thicket of the meadow. There he soon saw with his own eyes the goose girl and the goose boy bringing their flock, and how after a while she sat down and unplaited her hair, which shone with radiance, and soon she said, "Blow, blow, thou gentle wind, I say, blow Conrad's little hat away, and make him chase it here and there, until I've braided all my hair and bound it up again." Then came a blast of wind, and carried Conrad's hat, so that he had to run far away. While the maiden quietly went on combing her hair, all of which the king observed. Then, quite unseen, he went away. And when the goose girl came home in the evening, he called her aside, and asked why she did all these things. "I may not tell you that, and I dare not lament my sorrows to any human being, for I have sworn not to do so by the heaven which is above me, and if I had not done that, I should have lost my life." He urged her and let her know peace, but he could not draw nothing from her. Then said he, If you will not tell me anything, tell your sorrows to the iron... Tell your sorrows to the iron stove there. And he went away. Then she crept into the iron stove, and began to weep and lament, and emptied her whole heart, and said, "Here I am, deserted by the whole world, and yet I am a king's daughter, and a false waiting-maid has by force brought me to such a pass that I have been compelled to put off my royal apparel, and she has taken my place with my bridegroom, and I have had to perform menial service as a goose girl. If my mother did but know that, her heart would break." The aged king, however, was standing outside by the pipe of the stove, and was listening to what she said, and heard it. Then he came back again, and bade her to come out of the stove. And royal garments were placed on her, and it was marvelous how beautiful she was. The king summoned his son, and revealed to him that he had got the false bride, who was only a waiting-maid, but that the true one was standing there as the sometime goose girl. The young king rejoiced with all his heart when he saw her beauty and her youth, and a great feast was made ready, to which all the people and all good friends were invited. At the head of the table sat the bridegroom, with the king's daughter at one side of him, and the waiting-maid on the other. But the waiting-maid was blinded, and did not recognize the princess in her dazzling array. When they had eaten and drunk and were merry, the aged king asked the waiting-maid as a riddle what a person deserved who behaved in such and such a way to her master, and at the same time related the whole story, and asked what sentence such a one merited. Then the false bride said, "She deserves no better a fate than to be stripped entirely naked and put in a barrel, which is studded inside with pointed nails, and 2 white horses should be harnessed to it, which it will drag her along through one street after another till she is dead." "It is you," said the aged king, "and you have pronounced your own sentence, and thus it shall be done unto you." When the sentence had been carried out, the young king married his true bride, and both of them reigned over their kingdom in peace and happiness. And that is the end of the story of the Goose Girl. And that will conclude our story for this week. Next week, we'll be reading a story which is a little more familiar to most of us in the audience, I think. Next week, we should be reading Cinderella. And then after Cinderella, it looks like the next story is The Devil's 3 Gold Hairs. The Devil's 3 Gold Hairs. And those will be our stories for next week. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed the show. I'm going to go ahead and go to the endings page. And as we end, let me see. I have a friend who is streaming right now. Deeves. And Deeves is playing, last I checked, Mass Effect. The new Mass Effect, re-release. So I'm gonna go ahead and send, my viewers, over there. If you don't mind. Enjoy the stream, and I hope to see you next week with the next bedtime stories.